Lagos, Nigeria. Easter Sunday, 2024. A megachurch congregation of 72,000 people rises to their feet in unified worship. The sound is deafening, a tsunami of voices that makes the building tremble. Just 3 miles away, construction crews are working overtime to complete yet another cathedral, this one designed to hold 90,000 worshippers. The architect? A former atheist who converted after witnessing what he calls the unstoppable force reshaping Africa. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away in Stockholm, Sweden, another church stands silent. Built in 1887 to accommodate 2,000 faithful, it now houses 12 people on an average Sunday. Next month, it will be converted into luxury apartments. The pews will be torn out. The altar will become someone's breakfast nook. The cross will come down. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of the most dramatic religious transformation in modern history. A complete reversal happening so fast that demographers can barely keep up with the numbers. Something extraordinary is occurring across 2 continents, and the implications will reshape global Christianity, politics, economics, and culture for the next century. In 1900, approximately 9% of all Christians lived in Africa. That's 9 out of every 100 believers. Today, that number has exploded to over 26%, more than 600 million Christians across the continent. By 2050, if current trends continue, Africa will be home to over 40% of the world's Christians. We're talking about more than 1 billion African Christians within 25 years. The speed is what shocks researchers. Nigeria alone adds approximately 9 million Christians per decade. That's roughly the entire population of Sweden converting every 10 years, except they're not converting from Islam or traditional religions at that rate. They're being born into Christian families who are having children at replacement levels while maintaining their faith, unlike their Western counterparts. But here's where it gets really interesting. While African Christianity surges forward like a wildfire in dry grass, Western Christianity is experiencing what some scholars call the Great Emptying. In the United Kingdom, church attendance has dropped from 40% of the population in 1960 to less than 6% today. France, once called the eldest daughter of the church, now sees less than 5% of its population attending Mass regularly. In the Netherlands, 50% of all church buildings have been closed, sold, or repurposed in the last 30 years. Germany tells an even more striking story. The country loses approximately 500,000 church members every single year, not to death, but to voluntary resignation. Germans actually have to officially deregister from church membership, and they're doing it in record numbers. The Catholic Church in Germany alone lost over 522,000 members in 2022. The Protestant churches, another 480,000 gone. So, what's happening? Why are 2 regions of the world, both with deep Christian roots, moving in completely opposite directions at breakneck speed? The easy answer would be to blame secularization, modernity, or education, the narrative that enlightenment naturally leads people away from faith. But that narrative collapses when you examine the facts on the ground. Africa isn't becoming more Christian because it's becoming less educated. In fact, the opposite is true. Take Kenya, where Christianity has grown alongside one of Africa's most impressive educational expansions. University enrollment has increased by over 600% since 2000, while church attendance has remained strong and in many areas has actually increased. In Ghana, where literacy rates have climbed from 28% in 1970 to 79% today, Christianity hasn't declined. It's diversified and strengthened. The megachurches aren't filled with the uneducated poor, though they're certainly welcome. They're packed with university students, engineers, doctors, and business owners who see no contradiction between scientific literacy and Christian faith. I want to pause here and ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it where you are? Are you in Lagos or London? Nairobi or New York? Seoul or Stockholm? Drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about the global spread of people interested in this topic. And while you're down there, let me know what profession you're in. Are you a student? A pastor? An atheist economist trying to understand market trends? A sociologist? Your perspective matters, and I read these comments. The story really begins in the late 19th century when European missionaries arrived in Africa with an interesting mix of motivations. Some came with genuine faith and a desire to spread the gospel. Others came with colonial ambitions, using Christianity as a tool of cultural imperialism. They built schools and hospitals, yes, but they also tried to suppress local languages, customs, and traditions. Christianity arrived in Africa wearing European clothes, quite literally. But something unexpected happened. Africans didn't just accept this imported faith, they transformed it. They translated the Bible into hundreds of local languages. They incorporated indigenous musical styles, worship patterns, and community structures. They read the biblical narratives through African eyes and found stories that resonated with their own experiences. The Old Testament stories of tribes, covenants, ancestors, and liberation from oppression spoke to African experiences in ways that European missionaries never anticipated. By the 1920s, African-initiated churches began breaking away from European control. These weren't just administrative separations, they were theological declarations of independence. The African independent churches, as they became known, maintained core Christian doctrines, while rejecting the cultural imperialism that came packaged with European Christianity. They created something new, an authentically African Christianity. A prophet named William Wade Harris walked across West Africa from 1913 to 1915, converting an estimated 120,000 people. He didn't represent any European denomination. He wore local dress, preached in local languages, and connected biblical truth to African cultural contexts. The colonial authorities eventually arrested and deported him, but the movement he started couldn't be stopped. Fast forward to today. The fastest-growing churches in Africa aren't branches of European or American denominations. They're indigenous movements led by African pastors with African theological emphasis. The Redeemed Christian Church of God, which started in Nigeria in 1952, now has churches in over 200 countries. The Deeper Christian Life Ministry reaches millions. Winners Chapel operates one of the largest church auditoriums in the world, seating 50,000 people with standing room for another 50,000. These aren't just big buildings with celebrity pastors, though they have those too. They're sophisticated theological movements with publishing houses, universities, television networks, and social service programs. They're training the next generation of African Christian leaders who will shape global Christianity in the 21st century. But numbers don't tell the whole story. We need to understand the why behind the growth, and this is where things get fascinating, because the reasons are complex, contradictory, and completely different from what most Western observers expect. First, there's the prosperity gospel, but not the caricature version that Western critics often describe. Yes, African Pentecostalism often includes teachings about material blessing, divine health, and God's desire for believers to prosper. Critics in the West dismiss this as exploitation or theological error. But for millions of Africans living in contexts of genuine poverty, structural inequality, and limited social mobility, the message that God cares about their material well-being and wants to see them succeed isn't prosperity light, it's liberation theology. A street vendor in Kampala who hears that God values her work, wants her business to succeed, and has the power to transform her economic circumstances isn't being duped. She's being given hope, agency, and a theological framework that makes her an active participant in her own economic redemption rather than a passive victim of circumstances. Whether this theology is completely sound is debatable, but its psychological and practical power is undeniable. Second, African Christianity offers community in contexts where traditional social structures are rapidly changing. Urbanization is happening in Africa at a pace unprecedented in human history. Lagos grows by approximately 77 people per hour. Kinshasa doubles in population every 15 years. People are leaving villages where everyone knew everyone for cities, where they're anonymous and alone. Churches fill that void. They don't just offer Sunday services, they provide wedding support, funeral assistance, business networks, childcare cooperation, and emergency financial help. A migrant from rural Tanzania arriving in Dar es Salaam can walk into a church on Sunday and walk out with a job lead, a place to stay, and 10 new contacts by Wednesday. This isn't incidental to the church's mission. It's central to how African Christianity understands itself. Third, and this is crucial, African Christianity takes the supernatural seriously in ways that Western Christianity largely abandoned. Prayer for healing isn't a desperate last resort after medicine fails. It's a primary response. Spiritual warfare isn't a metaphor for internal struggles. It's a real battle against real forces. Prophecy, divine guidance, miracles, and direct supernatural intervention aren't embarrassing relics from a pre-scientific age. They're expected parts of normal Christian life. A Nigerian engineer can spend her day applying rigorous scientific methodology to petroleum extraction and then spend her evening at a prayer meeting, seeking prophetic guidance about a family situation. She sees no contradiction. The Western Enlightenment dichotomy between the scientific and the spiritual never took full root in African Christian consciousness. Now let's turn to the West, because you can't understand the divergence without understanding both trajectories. Western Christianity is dying, but it's been dying for a long time, and the autopsy reveals multiple causes of death. Some are theological, some are cultural, some are demographic, and some are self-inflicted wounds. The secularization started earlier than most people realize. By the late 19th century, European intellectuals were already declaring God dead. Nietzsche's famous proclamation in 1882 wasn't a sudden revelation. It was an observation of a process already underway. The Enlightenment had planted seeds of doubt in the necessity of religious faith. Darwin challenged biblical literalism. Marx offered an alternative explanation for human meaning. Freud suggested religion was psychological projection. But for decades, these intellectual currents remained mostly confined to universities and elite circles. The average European still attended church, still married in churches, still buried their dead with Christian ceremonies. Cultural Christianity remained strong even as theological Christianity weakened. 2 world wars accelerated the decline. How do you maintain faith in a benevolent God after watching millions of young men die in trenches? How do you sing hymns about God's protective love after Auschwitz? The theological problem of evil, always Christianity's most difficult intellectual challenge, became viscerally, undeniably real for an entire generation. The 1960s brought the sexual revolution, which created an unbridgeable gap between traditional Christian sexual ethics and the lived reality of most Westerners. When your church teaches that premarital sex is sinful, but 95% of your congregation has experienced it, you have a credibility problem. When your denomination opposes contraception but your parishioners are using it anyway, the disconnect becomes obvious. Churches had 2 choices: adapt or maintain traditional teachings. Different denominations chose different paths. Those that adapted often found themselves asking, if we change this teaching, what makes us distinctively Christian? If biblical authority is negotiable on sexuality, why not on other doctrines? The progressive path led to theological uncertainty. Those that maintained traditional teachings found themselves increasingly out of step with surrounding culture. Their children left. Their numbers dwindled. Their average age crept upward. They became museums of a vanishing worldview. Meanwhile, the welfare state replaced many of the church's practical functions. Need help with poverty? Apply for government assistance. Need education? Public schools are free. Need health care? National health systems provide it. Need community? Join a hobby group or connect online. The church's monopoly on social services, education, and community ended, and with it, one of the main practical reasons people participated in church life. But here's the twist that many observers miss. Western Christianity isn't declining uniformly, it's polarizing. Liberal mainline Protestant churches are collapsing. The United Methodist Church lost over 6 million members in the United States between 1970 and 2020. The Episcopal Church dropped from over 3.5 million to less than 2 million. The Presbyterian Church USA went from over 4 million to 1.5 million. These aren't gentle declines, these are institutional collapses. Meanwhile, conservative evangelical churches and traditional Catholic parishes that maintain Orthodox teachings are holding relatively steady or growing slowly. The churches that tried to accommodate secular culture are dying faster than the churches that resisted it. That's counterintuitive, but the data is consistent across multiple countries. Why? Because religious institutions that ask nothing of their members offer nothing that secular institutions can't provide better. If your church's message is essentially, be a good person and God loves you, why wake up early on Sunday? You can be a good person without church. You can feel spiritual while hiking. You can find community at a coffee shop. The irony is bitter. The churches that liberalized to remain relevant became irrelevant faster than the churches that refused to change. Demographics tell another part of the story. Western Christians have far fewer children than their grandparents did. The average fertility rate across Western Europe is approximately 1.5 children per woman, well below the replacement rate of 2.1. In Spain and Italy, it's even lower, hovering around 1.2. Contrast that with Africa. Nigeria's fertility rate is approximately 5.3 children per woman. Niger's is over 6.7. Even as African fertility rates slowly decline with development, they remain well above replacement level, and crucially, Christian Africans are having children at similar or even slightly higher rates than their Muslim neighbors in many countries. The math is simple. If every generation of Western Christians has fewer children, and a growing percentage of those children leave the faith, the numbers drop exponentially. If every generation of African Christians has more children and maintains high retention rates, the numbers explode. If you're finding this valuable and you appreciate the research that goes into these videos here at Professor Archive, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But whether you do or not, I'm grateful you're here thinking through these complex issues with me. There's also a profound philosophical difference in how African and Western Christianity engage with suffering and evil, and this might be the most important distinction of all. Western theology, shaped by centuries of Enlightenment rationalism, tends to treat suffering as a problem requiring explanation. Theodicy, the justification of God in the face of evil, becomes a central intellectual concern. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does evil exist? Entire libraries of Western theology attempt to answer this question through philosophical argument. African theology, by contrast, tends to treat suffering as a reality requiring response rather than explanation. The question isn't, why does God allow this? But, how do we overcome this with God's power? This isn't intellectual avoidance, it's a different epistemological framework shaped by different historical experiences. A congregation in Kinshasa dealing with poverty, corruption, and violence doesn't need sophisticated philosophical arguments about the nature of evil. They need power to overcome evil. They need hope that tomorrow can be different. They need a God who actively intervenes in human affairs. African Christianity offers that. It promises a God who heals, who provides, who protects, who defeats enemies, who transforms situations. Whether or not this matches reality in every case, it provides a psychologically powerful framework for engaging with life's hardships. Western Christianity, meanwhile, often offers sophisticated explanations that provide intellectual satisfaction, but little emotional or practical power. You can understand why evil exists through free will theology or soul-building theodicy, but that understanding doesn't heal your depression, fix your marriage, or pay your rent. The contrast shows up in worship styles. Walk into a typical Western European church service, and you'll find 20 or 30 elderly people sitting quietly in pews, singing hymns written 2 centuries ago, listening to a carefully prepared sermon that engages intellectual themes. Applause is rare, emotional displays are awkward. Everything is orderly, predictable, contained. Walk into a typical African megachurch, and you'll find thousands of people of all ages, standing, dancing, shouting, singing contemporary songs with full bands, participating actively in prayers that expect immediate divine response. The service might last 3 or 4 hours. People might prophesy spontaneously. Healing prayers might include visible manifestations. It's loud, emotional, chaotic, alive. Which one attracts young people? Which one grows? The intellectual class in the West often dismisses African Christianity as unsophisticated, emotional, or theologically shallow. But this reveals more about Western prejudices than about African Christianity. Some of the most sophisticated theological work being done today comes from African theologians who are wrestling with contextualization, poverty, justice, and the relationship between Christianity and African traditional religions. Scholars like Kwame Bediako, John Mbidi, Mercy Amba Oduyoye, and Emmanuel Katongole have produced theological work that rivals anything coming out of Western seminaries. Work that takes both Orthodox Christian doctrine and African contexts seriously without collapsing one into the other. African Christianity isn't just growing numerically, it's developing theological depth that will shape global Christianity for generations. Already, African bishops in the Anglican Communion have taken leadership roles in defending traditional Christian sexual ethics against Western progressivism. African theologians are challenging Western individualism with communitarian alternatives. African missiologists are sending missionaries back to Europe and North America to re-evangelize the post-Christian West. The tables have turned. The missionary societies that sent Europeans to Africa in the 19th century are now receiving African missionaries in the 21st. A Congolese pastor plants churches in Brussels. A Nigerian evangelist leads crusades in London. A Ghanaian bishop oversees struggling Anglican parishes in rural England. This creates fascinating tensions. African Christianity tends to be theologically conservative on issues like sexuality, gender roles, and biblical authority, positions that increasingly put it at odds with Western progressive values. When African bishops opposed the ordination of openly gay clergy in the Anglican Communion, Western observers accused them of homophobia. The Africans responded that they were simply maintaining traditional Christian teaching that the West had abandoned for cultural reasons. Who's right? That depends on your theological framework. But the point is that African Christians increasingly have the demographic and institutional power to shape these debates. The future of global Christianity will be determined as much in Lagos and Nairobi as in Rome or Canterbury, maybe more so. Economics plays a role too, though perhaps not the way you'd expect. Critics often claim that African Christianity grows because churches exploit the poor, offering false hope in exchange for tithes that enrich pastors. There are certainly examples of exploitation. African Christianity isn't immune to corruption any more than Western Christianity is. But the broader economic story is more complex. Many African churches invest heavily in education, healthcare, and economic development. They run universities, hospitals, vocational training programs, and microfinance initiatives. The church becomes an engine of social mobility and human capital development. A young woman joins a church in Accra. The church helps her get business training. She starts a small tailoring operation. She hires other church members. Her business grows. She tithes back to the church, which uses that money to help more young entrepreneurs. Within a decade, she's employing 50 people and serving on the church's business development board. This isn't exploitation. It's social entrepreneurship embedded in religious community. It creates virtuous cycles of economic development that benefit both individuals and communities. Contrast this with Western Europe, where Christianity is often associated with declining institutions, irrelevant traditions, and resistance to progress. Why would a young, ambitious, future-oriented person in Berlin or Paris join such a thing? Let's address a question that's probably occurring to you. Is this really about Christianity, or is it about development stages? Is Africa becoming more Christian because it's at an earlier stage of economic development? And will it eventually secularize as it becomes wealthier, just like the West did? This is the standard secularization thesis, and it made sense for a long time. As countries develop economically, the theory goes, they inevitably secularize. Religion declines as science, education, and prosperity increase. It happened in Western Europe. It happened in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It's happening in parts of East Asia. But the thesis has cracks. The United States is wealthy, educated, and scientifically advanced, yet far more religious than Western Europe. South Korea industrialized rapidly and became more Christian, not less. Singapore is one of the wealthiest countries in the world and maintains high levels of religious practice. The secularization thesis assumed that Western Europe's path was universal. But what if Western Europe is the exception rather than the rule? What if the specific historical, cultural, and philosophical factors that led to European secularization don't automatically apply everywhere else? There's evidence that African Christianity might not follow the Western trajectory. Countries like Kenya and Ghana have seen simultaneous increases in education, GDP per capita, and Christian practice. The assumption that educated Africans will abandon faith hasn't materialized. Why? Partly because African Christianity has successfully integrated with modernity in ways that Western Christianity struggled to do. An African Christian can embrace smartphones, democracy, market economics, higher education, and modern medicine while maintaining robust faith. The integration works because African Christianity never fully accepted the Enlightenment dichotomy between faith and reason that created such tensions in the West. Additionally, African Christianity provides goods that modernity doesn't replace: meaning, purpose, community, identity, moral framework, and transcendent hope. As long as these human needs persist, institutions that meet them will survive, even in contexts of economic development. The geopolitical implications are staggering. By 2050, if trends continue, the typical Christian will be a young woman living in Lagos, Kinshasa, or Nairobi, not an elderly person in Rome, London, or New York. The center of gravity of global Christianity is shifting south and east. This will affect everything. Christian political theology will increasingly reflect African concerns: poverty, corruption, tribal conflict, development, and decolonization. Christian ethics will engage with polygamy, communal land ownership, and extended family structures. Christian worship will incorporate African musical styles, languages, and cultural expressions. Western Christians will have to decide whether to embrace this shift or resist it. Some Western Christians already reject African Christianity as insufficiently sophisticated or too influenced by prosperity gospel theology. But these Western critics increasingly lack the numbers to determine global Christianity's direction. The Catholic Church has already recognized this reality. Pope Francis, though Argentinian rather than African, represents the Church's shift away from its European center. African cardinals now hold significant power in the Vatican. The next pope might very well be African, a development that would have been unthinkable 50 years ago but now seems probable. Protestant Christianity is more decentralized, but the same shift is occurring. The largest Protestant churches in the world are now in South Korea and Nigeria, not the United States or England. Global evangelical networks increasingly defer to non-Western leadership. There's a delicious irony here. European colonizers brought Christianity to Africa as part of a civilizing mission, assuming European cultural superiority. Now, African Christians are evangelizing post-Christian Europe, seeing it as a mission field that has fallen into paganism and needs re-Christianization. The colonized are converting the colonizers. How does this story end? No one knows, but we can identify possible trajectories.